Now that we're able to mark tasks as completed, we of course also want to make sure that we can add tasks. And here I got another exercise for you. I want you to create a first basic version of such a component, which doesn't need any styling at all, doesn't matter where it appears, doesn't need a form, just some shell which outputs some text. And I want you to build that component, add it to the application, and make sure that it shows up anywhere on the screen, doesn't matter where, when that Add Task button is clicked. So that you add the code that listens for a click and that then conditionally renders this newly added new task component. That's your task right now. After a short pause, which you can use to pause the video and try this on your own, we'll implement this together. So let's add this new component together now. For this, I'm back in the project, of course, and I'll again use the CLI to generate a new component, and I want to have that component in the tasks folder, and then there it's the new -task component I want to add. And if you have component names that consist of multiple names, you should separate them with a dash like this. I don't need the tests, so again I will add --skip tests, and with that this new task folder here is added. Now, as mentioned, at the moment I don't care how it looks and where it appears, so I'll just keep that default starting content, this dummy text here, in the new task component HTML file. And I just want to make sure that it shows up if this button in the tasks component here is clicked, if this add task button is clicked. Therefore, I'll start by adding a click listener to this add task button. And I'll then add a new method to this tasks component TS file. And I'll name this method onStartAddTask, because this kind of describes what's happening when the button is clicked. We start the process of adding a new task by conditionally showing a component that will allow us to enter the task details. I also need an extra property which controls whether this new task component is visible or not. Therefore, here at the top, maybe above the tasks, the exact position doesn't matter, I'll add a new property called isAddingTask. The name is up to you, but it should be a name that describes the value that's stored in the property. And here I'll set this to false initially. And since I'm assigning that initial value, TypeScript is able to infer the type of value I plan on storing on this property in general. It correctly infers that it'll be a Boolean, which I'll store in this property. As a side note, you could explicitly add this type annotation nonetheless, but this is not required and also not recommended if the inferred type is the correct type. So isAddingTask is false initially, but it should be changed to true if we trigger onStartAddTask. So in here, I want to set isAddingTask to true. And now in the tasks component HTML file, I want to use this newly added isAddingTask property to conditionally show this new task component. So we can use addIf here and check if isAddingTask is true. And if it is, I want to output app-new-task. That is the selector of this new task component that was added by the CLI. Now, as always, this must be added to the imports in order to be available in the tasks component. So that is something that must be done. The new task component must be imported and added to the imports here. But with that done, it can be rendered. And then here, with this event binding on this button, we can and should execute this newly added onStartAddTask method. With that, if you save that and you click Add Task, you will see that this new task component appears, and that's therefore working as it should. Now we can start working on that component so that we do actually open it as a dialog and show some form. So now I want to work on the template and the styling of this new task component. And for that, attached, you actually find a prepared new task component HTML file, which includes a dialog that's always open, which then in turn holds a form with some input fields. Now, there's no Angular specific code in there, which is why I prepared it for you, just so that we save some time and we don't have to write it all together. But in the end, it's just some markup that will use the default browser built-in dialog element to show a form as an overlay above the rest of the page content. And attached, you therefore also find a new task component CSS file, which includes some required styles. With that, if you use these two attached files, the HTML and the CSS file, if you save everything, you should be able to add a task and get this overlay dialog when trying to do that. But of course, at the moment, this dialog doesn't do anything, and we also can't really close it, because that's now the logic we'll add together with help of Angular. And let's start with making sure that we can close it. For example, by clicking on the backdrop or by clicking this cancel button here. And the idea is to essentially emit an event from inside this new task component when this backdrop or this cancel button here is clicked, a cancel event, let's say, which can then be handled by the tasks component, which is the component that is rendering this new task component, so that we set this isAddingTask property in that tasks component back to false, which it also is initially if we clicked on cancel or the backdrop. Now again, this is definitely something you can try implementing on your own first, because you will only need knowledge you already gained thus far, but after a short pause, which you can use to pause the video, we'll implement it together. So to make this dialog closable, I will start here in the tasks component TypeScript file by adding another new method. Maybe here at the bottom, though the exact position doesn't matter. And I'll name it onCancelAddTask. That sounds like a fitting name because it should be invoked when we cancel this process. And in there we can set isAddingTask to false, which, because of the code in its template, will then remove this new task component from the DOM, because this is only rendered conditionally with help of addIf if isAddingTask is true. If isAddingTask is set to false, it will therefore be removed by Angular automatically because of how Angular works and because of our declarative template code here. So therefore now we of course must make sure that we do invoke onCancelAddTask if the dialog is closed. And therefore we should go to the new task component HTML file, which is responsible for rendering that dialog. And we should add click listeners here on that backdrop div, so that clicking the backdrop will close the dialog, and on this cancel button here. By the way, it's important that this button here is of type button, not because of Angular, but because of how the web works, because if it would be of type submit, it would actually trigger a form submission, which could have unwanted side effects. By setting this button to type button, this will not occur. But that's just a side note, not specific to Angular. Now these click listeners on the cancel button and the backdrop should invoke a method inside of the new task component. So in here, in the component class, we can add a new onCancel method. And now I want to emit a custom event whenever that happens. So as you learned it before, we should use addOutput here. which of course is imported from Angular core, as always, and then add our own event property, which could be named cancel, since this accurately describes the kind of event we're adding here. Now this should be a new event emitter, as always, imported from Angular core. And this will be an event emitter that will actually not transmit any kind of data. Therefore, as a generic type annotation, you should add the special void type here. Now, that is something you didn't know in advance, but you could also set it up without any generic type information at all. Void is just a special type that essentially means that there will be no data being emitted. And with that, we can then go here to onCancel and use our cancel property to emit a new event which does not carry any data. And now with that, we can use this onCancel method here in the new task component HTML file, both for the backdrop click listener and this cancel button click listener. And we can then use our own cancel event here, so to say, in the tasks component template to listen for that cancel event on the new task component instance. And then here we want to invoke onCancelAddTask. This method we added a couple of minutes ago. If you now save everything, you should be able to open this dialog, but to then also close it by clicking on the backdrop like this, or by clicking on the cancel button. And that's another important step into the right direction. Next, we of course want to make sure that we also extract the entered data and we actually do create a new task.